In 30 years in the video game market, Nintendo has released many fantastic games and created a whole series of incredibly good game franchises. The Mario and Zelda games are among the most well-known and successful game series. But I don't even want to start talking about which franchises Nintendo still has up its sleeve and unfortunately hasn't revived in years, if not decades. Well, at least I want to talk about one of these forgotten game series today. In November 1990, the first F-Zero was released on the Super Famicom, marking the beginning of an incredibly good, but unfortunately not very successful game series for Nintendo. Over the course of 14 years, several F-Zero titles were released for different consoles, but unfortunately that came to an end in 2004. In this video, I take a look back at the origin story of the future racers, review all the installments in the series, and explore the question of why we haven't seen a new installment in damn 17 years. Enjoy this video about the rise and fall of F-Zero. As is often the case, our story does not actually begin in the launch year of the first F-Zero game. Instead, we must travel back 2 years. In April 1988, Nintendo released the second installment of their Famicom Grand Prix series on the Famicom Disk System. The racing game, which was also contributed to by the legendary Satoru Iwata, showcased the capabilities of the Famicom Disk System, as the racing game thrilled players with smooth scrolling and the resulting pseudo 3D effect. The same year that Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally was released, the Genesis by Sega also came out. Nintendo's biggest competitor introduced its next-gen console and aimed to outpace Nintendo in the upcoming bit console war. The Sega console offered more hardware power, more colors, and better sound quality. But Nintendo was not disturbed by the Genesis. The company held on to its Famicom, as it continued to sell very well both in Japan and in the Western market. Nintendo intended to release the aforementioned Famicom Grand Prix 2 3D Hot Rally next year from the Famicom Disk System on the NES, which was successful in the West. To this end, the director of the racing game, Kazunoubu Shimizu, traveled to America in early 1989 to present the game to Nintendo of America and discuss how and when it would be best to release it. The leadership at Nintendo of America was far from enthusiastic. With the Sega Genesis looming, which launched in the USA in 1989, the bosses at Nintendo of America dismissed Shimizu's game as boring and generic. They said that something like this wouldn't sell in the West, especially when comparing the racing game to a launch title of the Sega Genesis. Shimizu received a harsh rejection. However, before he flew back to Japan disappointed, he wanted to make the most of his stay in the States. To clear his mind, Shimizu decided to watch a movie. He chose Tim Burton's Batman, which was a box office hit at the time. Kazunoubu Shimizu was thrilled by the Dark Avenger. Above all, he was captivated by the costume design and the design of the vehicles. Now he understood what his colleagues at Nintendo of America meant when they dismissed his game as boring. Before the return flight, Shimizu stocked up on Batman comics, motivated to revise 3D Hot Rally for the American market and present it to Nintendo of America again. Upon arriving in Japan, Shimizu showed the Batman comics to his colleague Yasunari Nishida, who, in the meantime, was being assigned a very special task by Nintendo of Japan. Nishida needed to think about how to utilize the brand new Mode 7 effect of the upcoming Super Famicom console to demonstrate the power of the new console. When Nishida learned that Shimizu wanted to redesign his Famicom racing game for the American market, he suggested to his colleague to create a brand new game from the resulting ideas using the power of the Mode 7 feature. That was the starting signal for a game that was set to usher in a completely new subgenre in the racing game sector. But what exactly is this Mode 7? Well, Mode 7 is one of 8 graphics modes on the Super Famicom, or SNES. This mode serves the function of graphic representation. It is a texture mapping mode that can create seemingly dynamic, 3-dimensional views from 2-dimensional graphics. It is possible, among other things, to rotate and scale a background layer, thereby creating an effect of spatial depth. Nintendo was able to create a 3D effect with the graphics. When Shimizu saw this technology, he was immediately on board. That's it. I thought if we used Batman and Mode 7 to develop a racing game, it would shock everyone. Thus began the development of a racing game for the Super Famicom in 1989, which was set to be released in Japan in 1990. Initially, Shimizu and Nishida designed normal race cars that were supposed to speed around the track, but since it was exceedingly complex to accurately depict the tires of the vehicles from different perspectives, they were simply removed, marking the birth of the well-known hovercrafts. By the way, tires were not the only elements that fell victim to the technical limitations of the scissors. Originally, buildings were also supposed to be depicted along the track, but since this calculation was also hardware-intensive from various perspectives, the idea arose to set the racing game in the future and elevate the tracks above the rooftops of the cities. Alongside Shimizu and Nishida, Takaya Imamura was one of the key figures involved in the creation of F-Zero. Imamura was an art designer at Nintendo and received two important tasks. On one hand, he was supposed to take care of the character and vehicle design for the upcoming racing game, and on the other hand, someone at Nintendo of America expressed the desire for the Super Famicom to have its own mascot. Mario was certainly a familiar face associated with Nintendo, but for the new Power Console, a new cool face was needed, with a cool name, something with Captain. Imamura thus designed the F-Zero characters and the SNES mascot in one go, using the colors of the Super Famicom controller for Captain Falcon, the proposed name for the new console face, which included red, blue, and yellow in his suit. Regarding the overall design of the Mode 7 racing game, Imamura drew inspiration from the roots of the game that Shimizu found in the Batman comics. This is how F-Zero acquired its comic aesthetic, which is also reflected on the back of the original packaging and in the manual, which includes a small comic that summarizes the story. But back to the beginnings. When Imamura and Shimizu presented the game and the artworks to Nintendo of America, the American colleagues were more than excited. The idea of a new mascot for the new console was discarded, and Captain Falcon was added to the F-Zero character roster and simultaneously crowned as the main character of the game. After just 15 months of development, the team of 9 people completed their work, and F-Zero was able to launch as a title for the Super Famicom in Japan in November 1990. The press and fans were immediately thrilled. With 4 different hovercrafts, players could race on 15 different tracks in F-Zero, each presenting its own unique challenges. The Mode 7 graphics amazed everyone who got their hands on the racing game in 1990, and with 4 different difficulty levels, F-Zero kept players engaged with the controller longer than initially expected. To master all the cups, one had to learn the mechanics of the game, which resulted in a challenging gameplay experience. Harmful track boundaries that drained valuable energy from the hovercraft, treacherous curves, dangerous jumps, and annoying non-racing hovercraft that shared the track made every race an absolute highlight, even though the game was not without its criticisms. The meager number of playable vehicles and the lack of multiplayer were criticized above all. Only 4 vehicles were due to the limited development time, which also explained the lack of multiplayer. Personally, there were always 2 things that bothered me about F-Zero. First, I find the gliders that are off the track extremely annoying. I mean really annoying. Just like the collision detection that turns your hovercraft into a damn ping-pong ball, flying uncontrollably around when you kiss the wall or ram into an opponent, these 2 points meant that I personally never played much F-Zero as a child. But that's a completely different story. The mentioned criticisms did not harm the success. At the time, F-Zero was crowned by IGN as the fastest and smoothest racing game of its era. The clean presentation of the racing events and the stunning graphics ensured that F-Zero established the subgenre of future racers and sold an impressive 2.5 million copies. Nintendo impressively demonstrated what the Super Famicom or the SNES was capable of with F-Zero, but unfortunately a sequel on this device was denied to us, at least in the West, but more on that later. Only 6 years after the debut of the bit did information about a successor come to light. In July 1996, Nintendo Power Magazine reported on a new F-Zero game, but not for the N, which had been released in Japan a month earlier. No, the Nintendo Power Magazine published an article about G-Zero, a successor to F-Zero on the Virtual Boy. Here, 4 drivers should prove their skills on 15 different tracks in 2 different modes. Unlike in F-Zero, the races were to take place completely in 3-dimensional space this time, which was also meant to demonstrate the capabilities of the Virtual Boy. In the August 96 issue, the final name of the game was revealed, which was set to be released in fall 96 as Zero Races. The last preview report was in October 96 before Nintendo discontinued the game. The reason for this was the Virtual Boy itself, which flopped extremely, as we know. According to reports, Zero Races was completely developed. What a shame. However, shortly thereafter, F-Zero fans would receive some consolation, at least in Japan. In December '96, Nintendo released a kind of add-on called BS F-Zero Grand Prix via the Satellaview. Over a period of 4 weeks, F-Zero fans were able to download and play a new cup each week. Each cup was only available for download for 5 days, and featured the same tracks as the original from 1990, except for the final track, which was completely new, and developed for the Satellaview. In addition to the weekly cups, there were also 4 new gliders that could be downloaded. Gameplay-wise, BS F-Zero Grand Prix was identical to the original, but fans received a bit of new content 7 years after the first installment. In June 1997, BS F-Zero Grand Prix 2 was released, also via the Satellaview service and thus only in Japan. Originally intended as a full-fledged successor on cartridge, Nintendo decided to distribute it through the broadcasting service. In contrast to the first BS F-Zero, Grand Prix 2 was a true expansion with completely new tracks, divided into 3 different packages. Initially, in June 1997, players could secure a practice mode that allowed them to try out 5 of the 10 tracks. Between August 10th and 23, the remaining tracks could be loaded and raced in the form of the Ace League. Unfortunately, both BS F-Zero Grand Prix spin-offs remained exclusive to Japan, although I can understand the reasoning behind that decision. By 1997, no one was thinking about the SNES anymore. The N was at the door in Europe, and with the Saturn and the PlayStation, there were competitors in the market that made it clear that the era of the SNES was over. Many years later, however, ROMs for both BS F-Zero spin-offs have emerged and can be played, using flash modules like the FX Pack Pro. Fans received the true, real successor to F-Zero only in 1998 in the form of F-Zero X on the N. The first ideas for a true F-Zero on the N came to Miyamoto while he was working on the development of Mario 64. When he saw the racing game Wave Racer, which featured futuristic speedboats, he insisted on changing the design of the game. Thus, the futuristic Wave Racer became the jet ski game Wave Race. After completing the water sports hit, Miyamoto gathered the developers and began working on F-Zero 64, which was then revealed by Famitsu in mid-97 and was already playable at Space World 97. Nintendo made the promise that F-Zero 64 would be playable at a constant 60 frames. Nintendo achieved this by reducing the graphics of the game and cutting down on details for the hovercrafts and tracks, which received criticism but ultimately was the right decision. In the year F-Zero was released worldwide on the Nintendo and blew away pretty much everyone who tried the Future Racer. In addition to a constant 60 FPS, there were also content and gameplay changes. One of the criticisms of the original was addressed. In F-Zero X, there were not 4, but 30 races on the track at the promised 60 FPS. In those days, it was simply incredible. There were 5 cups available, each with 6 tracks, although initially only 3 of them could be selected, and the Joker and the Super Cool X Cup had to be unlocked. The latter even offered randomly generated tracks, which meant that players were constantly faced with new challenges when starting the X Cup. In addition to the Grand Prix mode, a new time trial and a multiplayer mode were also available. If you had 3 friends on hand, you could let loose in split screen with 4 players, even though the frame rate in multiplayer was halved from 60 to 30 FPS. With Death Race, F-Zero X also introduced a very special mode that unfortunately did not return in any other installment. Here, you were thrown into a kind of battle royale race and had to eliminate your opponents with a spin move or throw them off the track. Only when you were the last one remaining was the Death Race considered won. We thought it was super cool as kids and played this mode just as long as the Grand Prix. The biggest gameplay innovation was the new risk and reward system. In F-Zero, players received a boost after each race, while in F-Zero X, the boost was linked to the energy of the hovercraft. Executing a boost would decrease the energy. This gave the game a strategic touch, as players now had to weigh the use of the booster. If one handled it too carelessly, a premature knockout was threatened unless one was quick enough to reach the energy fields to recharge. This new boost system, combined with the still very high difficulty level that would become a hallmark of the series, provided an enormous replay value. If you really wanted to excel in F-Zero, you had to learn the boost mechanics, the gliders, and the tracks. The multiplayer mode was a nice bonus, but for many it was not a deciding factor. Regarding the graphics, F-Zero X was criticized by reviewers for its barren tracks and lack of track details, which did not measure up to other representatives of the genre. But when you were traveling at over 1500 km/h, and that at a constant 60 FPS, you really had no time to pay attention to the surroundings, or accompanied by powerful guitar riffs, a gaming sensation emerged that no other future racer on 5th-generation consoles could achieve. Regarding the prospects for success, F-Zero X, like its predecessor, became a million seller, with sales just surpassing the million mark at 1.1 million units sold. F-Zero X unfortunately sold worse than the original and worse than all other Nintendo racing games. Mario Kart 64, Digicon Racing, and even 1080 snowboarding sell more units. In the year 2000, it is estimated that only about 3% of all Nintendo 64 owners purchased F-Zero X. 1.5 years after the European release of F-Zero X, the F-Zero X expansion kit was released in Japan for the IDD. In April 2000, owners of the failed disc add-on could connect their F-Zero X cartridge with the expansion kit to unlock cool additions. F-Zero X was launched with the expansion kit inserted in the DD, which provided 12 new tracks, a vehicle, and a track editor. The latter was the absolute highlight of the expansion kit, as the track editor had also been worked on by the developers. All self-created tracks and vehicles could be saved and used in the game, which significantly increased the replay value and showcased the potential of the DD. Unfortunately, the DD flopped, which resulted in the F-Zero X expansion kit remaining exclusive to Japan, and today it is one of the most sought-after and also most expensive games for the disc add-on. What many do not know is that F-Zero X was the second but also the last F-Zero game developed internally by Nintendo. With the beginning of the new millennium, Nintendo commissioned external studios to breathe new life into the F-Zero franchise. In 2000, Nintendo founded the development studio NDCube in collaboration with Japan's largest advertising agency Dentsu, in which Nintendo held 78% of the shares until 2010. This allowed NDCube to publish games with other publishers outside of Nintendo, as you will see later. Starting in 2010, Nintendo increased its stake to 97%, making NDCube a first-party studio. Since 2001, the team at HandyCube has been responsible for exclusive games for Nintendo such as Super Mario Party. In 2000, NDCube was tasked with a project that was to launch as F-Zero Maximum Velocity with the release of the GBA in 2001. The portable Future Racer was heavily inspired by the SNES original and offered, in addition to a similar look with Mode 7 effects, only 4 hovercrafts, 5 laps per track, and a boost after each lap. In doing so, F-Zero Maximum Velocity took a step back from the grand and modern F-Zero X, but once again impressively showcased what Nintendo's new system was capable of. With a GBA link cable, it was even possible to connect up to 4 handhelds and race against each other in multiplayer. It was sufficient to have just one game cartridge, even though this limited the scope of the multiplayer mode. To this day, the first GBA F-Zero is the only spin-off without Captain Falcon and his well-known companions. However, this bothered fans and the press little in 2001. Overall, F-Zero Maximum Velocity was received positively. The only criticism was directed at the hefty difficulty level, which requires absolute precision even on the lowest setting. In 2001, it turned F-Zero Maximum Velocity into a game that demanded a lot from newcomers. The GBA launch title was well received, but it sold less than F-Zero X on the end throughout the entire lifespan of the GBA. Only 1.05 million units were sold, which increasingly concerned Nintendo and signaled that F-Zero was developing into a niche product, failing to reach the expected audience like a Mario or Zelda game. In February 2002, Nintendo, Sega, and Namco announced a joint partnership and the resulting Triforce arcade board. Inspired by the Zelda series, the Triforce represented the combined power of the 3 Japanese giants and was intended to enable the cost-effective development of modern arcade games. In terms of hardware, the Triforce arcade board was based on GameCube hardware with some small but notable differences. The Triforce arcade board was also able to play Sega's own GD-ROM discs and had expandable memory. The games developed for the Triforce arcade were, according to Namco, Nintendo, and Sega, also set to be released on Nintendo's home console, which ignited the imaginations of many fans. Just a few days after the announcement of the Triforce, Nintendo revealed initial details about a brand new F-Zero game that was in development for the Triforce arcade pod at an expo in Japan. A game titled F-Zero AX was to be developed by Sega's Amusement Vision team, utilizing the Super Monkey Ball engine. Leading the project was Toshihiro Nagoshi, who had already gained experience with other arcade races and was responsible for popular games such as Daytona USA. At the same time as F-Zero AX, a GameCube version was set to be released under the name F-Zero GX. If you had F-Zero GX and inserted a GameCube memory card into the F-Zero AX arcade machine, you could unlock content from AX in GX. At E3 2002, the first gameplay was shown and the audience was thrilled. But why did Nintendo's former arch-rival suddenly develop an F-Zero game? The answer lies in Nagoshi's love for the F-Zero franchise. When Sega exited the console market, the company celebrated its first successes on the GameCube with Super Monkey Ball. After the Triforce partnership, Nintendo proposed that Sega should develop a racing game for arcade and GameCube. Sega's executives approached Toshihiro Nagoshi, who, with his Amusement Vision team, had not only developed the excellent Super Monkey Ball but also had experience in racing games. Nagoshi himself was a big F-Zero fan and agreed on the condition that he could create a new F-Zero. Thus, the next installment developed into a true labor of love for Nagoshi, which is evident in every phase of the final product. At the same time, NDCube, the creators behind F-Zero Maximum Velocity, were also developing a D-Racer, which they pitched to Nintendo as a new F-Zero. However, since Nintendo had already given Sega the go-ahead, NDCube reached an agreement with NEC Interchannel to release the game as Tube Slider exclusively on Nintendo's GameCube. Tube Slider was first released in the USA and was naturally compared to F-Zero GX there, a comparison that Tubes unfortunately lost in every respect. Therefore, NEC decided not to distribute the title outside of the States. As for F-Zero, AX and GX, the games were released in 2003 in arcades and worldwide on the GameCube. GX continued where Nintendo had left off with F-Zero X. In 2003, Sega's F-Zero GX overshadowed all other racing games. The fireworks that were set off there would be regarded as an absolute reference in the future racer genre for many years to come. In addition to the well-known modes like Grand Prix, Time Trial, or Multiplayer, F-Zero GX also featured a story mode that guided fans through 9 extremely challenging chapters. F-Zero GX is considered the toughest installment in the entire series. Professionals struggled with the story mode, and many who bought F-Zero GX back then have not been able to finish it to this day. Neither have I. All in all, F-Zero GX was everything that fans of F-Zero had wished for. Even Miyamoto said that the game was a significant evolution for the F-Zero franchise. And like its predecessors, F-Zero GX once again showcased what could be achieved with Nintendo's new home console. For many, F-Zero GX represented not only the best F-Zero game but also the best future racer of all time. Nagoshi had delivered. Even Imamura, who had been involved with the series as a designer since the SNES days, found clear words. After I worked on the F-Zero series and saw the results of the collaboration with Sega, I was somewhat perplexed about how we could continue the franchise beyond F-Zero GX, a statement that still leaves a bitter aftertaste today. Despite the outstanding quality and the affection that GameCube owners and F-Zero fans felt, F-Zero GX sold poorly against all expectations. Only units could be sold. As a result, the best F-Zero game was also the worst-selling installment in the series. However, Nintendo continued to support the franchise in 2003. When F-Zero GX was released in Europe in October, an anime called F-Zero GP Legend started airing in Japan. The story of the young cop Rick Wheeler was told over 51 episodes. Accompanying the anime, the next GBA installment with the same name was released in Japan in November 2003 before F-Zero GP Legend came to the West in 2004, following the storyline of the anime including a story mode. For the second GBA installment of the franchise, it was not NDCube that was responsible again, but the development studio Zusek Incorporated. And Zusek delivered a fantastic job. With F-Zero GP Legend, fans received a spin-off that featured a story mode, new drivers, tracks, and a control scheme that was so direct that F-Zero GP Legend is considered by many, myself included, to be the best F-Zero experience. Elements of home consoles and handheld spin-offs were skillfully combined in GP Legend. Zusek implemented the boost system from F-Zero X and GX and offered a whopping 34 playable crafts, which had to be unlocked once again. In addition to the Grand Prix and story mode, there was also a brand new Zero Test mode that increased replay value with challenges. But GP Legend also sold below expectations. Although the anime was broadcast in the USA as well, the sales were meager, which led Nintendo to take action regarding the already planned and in development F-Zero Climax, which was released in Japan in 2004 and it was cancelled for the West. Developed again by Zusek, Climax was the retelling of the F-Zero anime and thus a direct sequel to Has GP Legend. A major innovation was the implementation of a track editor, which allowed players to create their own tracks and then race on them, similar to what the F-Zero X expansion kit later enabled. Due to Nintendo's decision to keep F-Zero Climax in Japan, many F-Zero fans in the West missed out on a great GBA game. And so, it is not surprising that F-Zero Climax became the worst-selling F-Zero game. If we are to believe the numbers reported by various sources, only copies of F-Zero Climax were sold in Japan. And that, my dear friends, was the nail in the coffin for the F-Zero series. Not that they were bad games, but each new F-Zero game sold fewer copies than the previous one. Those who played the F-Zero games quickly learned to love the Future Racer. The problem is that there aren't very many fans, as the sales figures indicate. And for a company like Nintendo, which also aims for profit maximization, sales figures like those of the F-Zero games are reason enough to bury the series. To this day, we only hear from Miyamoto that Nintendo has no ideas for a new F-Zero. Miyamoto was even surprised when he was asked in an interview when a new F-Zero would be coming, as the fans miss it. He was surprised that the demand was so high. But when we look at the sales figures, it doesn't surprise me. Since F-Zero Climax in 2004, 17 years have passed. This means that we have now waited longer for a new F-Zero game than the series has existed. Nintendo primarily uses Captain Falcon as a playable character in Super Smash Bros. In Mario Kart 8 and Nintendo Land, we are occasionally provided with content similar to F-Zero. But whether we will ever get a new F-Zero game is questionable at this point. Since 1998, Nintendo has not developed any F-Zero internally. Does it mean that they don't care about the series, or does it imply that they don't feel capable of developing a new F-Zero that is better than F-Zero GX? If not Nintendo, then who could help the F-Zero series achieve new glory? In 2011, a rumor circulated that Nintendo had approached Criterion Games in Europe to see if the creators of Burnout would be interested in developing a new F-Zero for the Wii U. However, since Criterion was busy with Need for Speed Most Wanted at the time, the racing game experts declined. In 2019, this story was denied by Alex Ward, the studio head of Criterion Games. How about Shinnen? The German studio proved with Almost RMX that they are indeed capable of developing good future racers. But do you trust the small indie studio from Germany with a project like F-Zero? I certainly have my doubts. To be honest, there are still Retro Studios and possibly Platinum Games. Retro would certainly be capable, as they already contributed to Mario Kart 7, but I think they are currently busy with Metroid Prime 4. And yeah, Hideki Kamiya can do action, but racing games, I don't know. Then better back to Sega. In an interview, Nagoshi said he would like to work on an F-Zero again if Nintendo agrees. According to his statement, he would make it a challenging game again, and not some casual stuff like Mario Kart. And I think that is really the best alternative. Nagoshi has delivered it before and could certainly do it again. Nintendo could test the interest with an HD remaster of F-Zero GX, and if it sells well, Nagoshi and his team could directly develop a sequel to GX, of course with an online mode. After all, we're talking about Nintendo. Would a smooth gaming experience with 29 other human drivers be possible on the Switch? I have my doubts here as well, but yes, that was it, my great F-Zero retrospective. Once you understand the development, you might be able to comprehend Nintendo's decision, even if it is a bitter one. But would you invest resources in a project that has been selling increasingly poorly over the past 14 years? Discuss in the comments. Let's show Nintendo that we haven't forgotten the franchise. I mean, if we are to believe Imamura, there is internal discussion about F-Zero, as the arts director revealed in an interview. Unfortunately, Imamura has retired after 30 years at Nintendo, so someone else would have to take care of the design for a potential new F-Zero. Let's wait and see. Until then, I hope I was able to entertain you with this video. I look forward to reading your experiences and memories of the F-Zero series in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, give it a like. If you're new to my channel, consider subscribing and don't forget to hit the bell. You won't miss any videos here on Spielewelten. I'm off for now. Adios, your Andy.